But right now, I am in the town of Middletown, Maryland. And in the 1860s, this road that you see right here behind me would have been the national road. This was the first major highway that was built in the United States. So as you can imagine, this was a very important artery for both the Union Army and the Confederates, who in September of 1862 had just invaded Maryland on their Maryland campaign. Now, this is all leading up to the Battle of Antietam, but before Antietam, there's another engagement between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia right up here at South Mountain. So on September 8th of 1862, the town of Middleton was going to find itself completely turned upside down when off to the east here, Confederate cavalry would have entered into town and rode right through the middle of town down the National Road, heading this way, the west, to South Mountain. And apparently right here in this area, there was a woman named Nanny Krause who had a home here. And the Confederates found that even though this was a slave state that they had entered into, they were getting a bit of a chilly reception. And this lady, Nanny Krause, apparently wrapped herself in the Union colors and was being quite defiant to the Confederates until they put a gun to her head and made her remove the colors. Now, a few days later, the cavalry is going to be followed up by Stonewall Jackson, and as he rode into town, there were some little girls who had red, white, and blue ribbons in their hair and came out and were defiantly waving these American flags at the Confederates and laughing at them. And Jackson is reported to have just bowed his head and tipped his hat and then turned to his staff and said, "We evidently have no friends in this town." Now, what they didn't know is that following close behind was the Army of the Potomac. So this drawing right here on this information panel shows the Union Army marching through Middletown on the National Road, and they would have had a little bit warmer reception than the Confederates had. And if you take a look, well, right here, that church with the large steeple was the Lutheran Church, and it still stands today. After the Battle of South Mountain, this church was going to serve as a Union hospital. In the last episode, we talked about how the Union Army, while encamped just outside of Frederick, recovered something called Special Order 191, which was a detailed outline of the plans of the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, in spite of having Lee's exact blueprint for the Maryland campaign, McClellan was going to do what McClellan does best and move slow. So as he is cautiously pursuing Lee to the west, he's eventually going to arrive in Middletown on September 14th. Now, at the South Mountain, just to the west of us here, there are three primary gaps. There's Turner Gap to the north, just to the south is Fox Gap, and then further to the south even still is Crampton's Gap. So the Army of the Potomac is going to get split, and they are going to be going through all three of those gaps, pursuing Lee's army. And where McClellan was going to be observing all of this from was right here in the steeple of the Reformed Church. So I moved up out of town, and I'm currently standing on South Mountain. And by September 14th, Robert E. Lee realized that he had a bit of a problem on his hands. The Army of the Potomac was much closer than it was supposed to be, and his army was scattered out everywhere. So what he was going to have to do was hold the gaps here at South Mountain until he could consolidate the Army of Northern Virginia. And one thing that he had in his favor is that opposing him is George McClellan, who's the most slow and overcautious general in the entire Union Army. So Lee tasked Divisional Commander D.H. Hill to go to Turner's Gap and Fox's Gap and defend these areas. D.H. Hill didn't know much about the area here. That was Jeb Stuart's territory, but he had moved south to Crampton's Gap. And whenever D.H. Hill starts seeing the road network and how the national road can be outflanked, well, he starts getting worried. So right here at Fox's Gap, which is south of Turner's Gap, he sends a brigade under the command of Garland to guard this area. And right here in the woods where I'm standing right now, which this is kind of hard to interpret because in 1862 this would have been all field, but he sends a brigade under the command of a guy by the name of Garland. Here in the vicinity of the Daniel Wise farm, they have a monument here to the North Carolina regiments. So Garland's brigade, these were made up of men who had volunteered from the state of North Carolina. And we're facing kind of to the east or southeast right now. And coming up in this direction right here would have been Skaman's brigade. So Skaman's brigade was a Union brigade that was made up of some Ohio regiments, and they were under the command of General Cox's division, which was in the 9th Corps under the command of Jesse Reno. If you hear that name Jesse Reno and you're asking yourself, I wonder if that's the same Reno that Reno, Nevada is named after, yes, it absolutely is. So here you can see the other side of this monument. But anyway, this line right here was going to be defended by Garland's brigade. And Garland is actually going to be killed in this assault. He was up with the 13th North Carolina Regiment, which was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ruffin, and he asked the general, he said, "General, why are you here?" And Garland replied, "I may as well be here as yourself." And Ruffin, was kind of arguing with him in the moment, and he said, "No, it's my duty to be here, and you should be leading the brigade from a safer position." About that moment, Ruffin gets hit in the hip, and just moments later, Garland also gets hit in the center of the back, and the bullet's going to exit about 2 inches above his right breast. And his last words were, "I am killed. Send for the senior colonel." Now, also involved in the attack on this position, leading it was the 23rd Ohio. And the 23rd Ohio was led by a man named Rutherford B Hayes. Yes, future President Rutherford B Hayes led the assault right here on South Mountain. He is also going to be wounded. He's going to be taken back to Middletown, where his wife is going to nurse him back to health. Also in the 23rd Ohio was another future president, a commissary sergeant by the name of William McKinley. So with the loss of a regimental commander and the death of the brigade commander, the North Carolina troops kind of start melting back to the west in the face of these Ohio regiments who are coming up towards Fox's Gap. And the Ohio regiments weren't doing great themselves. They were running out of ammunition. They were winded from having made this huge climb up to this point. And the divisions that they were expecting to kind of follow up the attack were nowhere to be seen. So anyway, it's like mid-morning getting into the afternoon, and things are almost like at a standstill. D.H. Hill is like feeding whoever he can get up into this area. And the fighting was going to continue through the afternoon. And long story short, the Union is going to end up being victorious in this area. But for Jesse Reno, who again was the 9th Corps commander, the fighting here at Fox's Gap on South Mountain is going to be the last battle that he will ever see. Towards the end of the day on the 14th, the Union attack here at Fox's Gap had really kind of died down. So 9th Corps Commander General Reno, who is a stocky, kind of a go-getter and an aggressive commander, decided to come up here himself and see what the holdup was. We're not too far from where Garland was killed, and as Reno was assessing the situation, a Confederate sharpshooter shot him right in the body, and he ended up being taken to the divisional command of his friend Sam Sturgis. And Sturgis, whenever he walked in, Reno said, "Hello, Sam, I'm dead." And Sturgis thought that he was joking. He didn't think it was really serious, and he's like, "No, I'm really hit bad." And Reno is going to be killed right here at South Mountain. There's one other thing that I want to mention before we leave Fox's Gap here that is honestly just exceptionally ugly. After the battle, of course, there are going to be dead soldiers on both sides who are lying all over the place, especially around Daniel Wise's farm. And some Union soldiers were put on burial detail. And the story goes that they were intoxicated and, just to be blunt, took 58 Confederate soldiers and dumped them down Daniel Wise's well. Now, that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the Union Army or for those guys because it makes them look exceptionally bad, because it is bad. It's not good for the Confederate dead. And it's sure not good for Daniel Wise, who now has 58 dead, rotting corpses in his well. Now, they were later pulled out of the well. I forget when, but they were pulled out of the well and then reinterred. But anyway, something kind of ugly in war that happened right here on South Mountain. All right, we're going to go ahead and move north to another spot where a legend was made among a brigade of guys who were known for the black hats that they wore. I've moved a little bit north over to Turner's Gap, and you'll probably hear some road noise behind me. That's because right through here is the National Road. That's that main artery that I was talking about that ran through Middletown and goes to another town to the west of here called Boonesboro. Well, the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac had been charged with going through Fox's Gap. The 1st Corps under Hooker was going to be going north of here, trying to not just go right down the National Road. So you would have had divisions under Meade and Ricketts up that way. There was one brigade that they left behind on the National Road, though. That was the brigade of John Gibbon. Gibbon was an old Army guy. He was an artillerist, and he was in charge of 4 regiments from the west, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, and the 19th Indiana. These were volunteers. Gibbon was a good leader, and he knew how to handle these guys. He knew that he couldn't run his brigade like, a regular army command. That volunteers had to be handled differently. So he would offer them, like time off if they accomplished certain things. And this was a tough bunch. And they, late in the day, were going to be charged with coming up the National Road and going up against Colquitt's men, who were largely from Georgia. I think there was one Alabama regiment in there as well. So again, this is the National Road, and we are looking to the east right now. So this is looking at the National Road from the position of the Confederates, mainly Colquitt's brigade, who would have, like I said, been made up largely of Georgians and one Alabama regiment. And coming towards them up the road would have been Gibbon's brigade. The charge was led by the 7th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana, and then in formation behind them was going to be the 2nd and 6th Wisconsin. And they're going to slam right into these guys from Georgia. Probably about 400 yards, 400 to 500 yards ahead of me. I can't go there right now because, well, I don't want to get squashed on the road and there's no place to pull off. But anyway, McClellan was observing the action of Gibbon's brigade from a point off to the east. And he asked somebody next to him, whose brigade is that? And they said, well, I believe it's Gibbon's brigade. And McClellan is reported to say, well, they must be made of iron. And from that point forward, well, Gibbon's brigade would be known as the Iron Brigade. Now, we're not going to be able to make it down to Crampton's Gap today, but by the end of the fighting that took place here, the Union held the high ground north of Turner's Gap. They also held the high ground around Fox's Gap, and the Iron Brigade held their position along the National Road. What this was going to do was allow Lee the time he needed to bring some of his men up out of the Harper's Ferry area and to kind of consolidate them around the town of Sharpsburg and prepare for McClellan's next move. And that was all going to come to an explosive head at the Battle of Antietam.